broadcasting. Broadcast. Oh, that's what that red light is. That red button. Okay. All right. We are broadcasting. Here we go. All right. So let's cover our heads for the reading of the verses. Someone hand me that tally, please. I ask you to stand and cover as is our custom here. For those of you who don't know, who may be watching the video down the line, I'm tethered. Standing up is kind of a problem, so I'll have to stay seated. Okay. Our verse, for some reason, I didn't bother writing down what verse it was. Okay. Our verse is Bamidbar, which is Numbers, chapter 16, verse 2. Beirut. Vayakumu lifnei Moshe ba'anasim mibnei Yisrael hamishim matatim nesiye edah ke'rieh moed anshe shem. All right, you may be seated. In most English versions of Levi, that's Matthew, chapter 16, verse 18, Yeshua, or Jesus, said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." Some translations say, "I will build my congregation," but most of them say church. The Greek text actually says, "Upon this rock I will restore my," and the Greek word is ekklesion. Ekklesion. Do you hear ecclesia there? The restoration of his ekklesion, his congregation. I will restore my congregation. The way that happens is on the revelation that Yeshua is, in fact, the Moshiach. That is the rock. Again, the Greek text did not say build, it said restore. It didn't say my church, it said my congregation, or you might put it my assembly. Yeshua was a Yehudi, he was a Jew. His assembly was the assembly of the Yehudim, of the Jews, not the Goim, the Gentiles. Before you write me off as a heretic or a lunatic, consider the words of Yeshua, of Jesus himself, in Levi, or Matthew chapter 15, verse 24, which says, "But he answered and said, I am not, I am not come, but for the lost sheep of the house of Yisrael." You hear Israel in that? Because to pronounce it properly, it's Yisrael. Or you may drop the Y sound and say Israel. That's where we get Israel. But Yeshua, Jesus himself said, "I am not come but for to start a new Christian church." He didn't say that, did it? "I am not come but for to start a new thing on the day of Pentecost." No, he didn't say that. In fact, I've mentioned it before. In Eusebius's version of church history, he doesn't even mention the day of Pentecost. He uses a whole different argument to try to prove that Christianity, which he admits is brand new, and this is in about 320 AD, about 300 years after Yeshua dies on the cross and raises from the dead. 300 years later, the man says, this new organization called Christian. Well, he's not saying Christian. He said Christianos, which is where you get Christian, obviously. He said that was brand new. Never even talked about the day of Pentecost. Never talked about Jesus coming to start something new. This is all more recent history being shoved back into this book. But he did not say, "I am come for the Christians, the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, or any of that stuff." He said, I am not sent, I am not come, but for the lost sheep. By the way, in Hebrew, sent and come is the same thing. If you're sent, you came, right? You come to some place because you were sent to that place. It's the same word. I am not come but for the lost sheep of the house of Yisrael. He said it himself. He wasn't here for the Jews. He was here for the Gentiles. Oh, good Lord, I just said that backwards. He was not here for the Gentiles. He was here for the Jews. Now, if Kepha, or if Peter, that's who Kepha is his real name. Peter is the perverted version of his name. If Kepha started the church on the day of Shavuot, on the day of Pentecost, where did they have their services? It's not like they could have held services in someone's home. 3,000 men were converted that day. Did you know that in those days, women and children weren't counted? That means that there were probably closer to 5,000 converts that first day, because if the man converted, the whole house converted. Are you following? Plus, the other thing you should know is that they weren't in some person's house. Think about it. How many people can you imagine that lived in a 10 by 10-ish size house could put 3,000 people in their front yard? Or for that matter, 150 people in their attic, as if they had one. No, they were in the house. That was the idiomatic term that the Yehudi, the Jews, used for the temple. And when they came out of the upper room in the temple, they were in what was called the women's court. And the women's court held about 5,000 people comfortably. And of those 5,000 people, it was called the women's court because that's as far as women could go. You had to be a man to be able to go up the Nicanor steps, through the Nicanor gates, into what they called the Jewish or men's court. So they didn't come out in that spot. They came out in the women's, because that's where the upper room was when you came down from there. You were in the women's court. So by the way, everybody in that court was Jewish. So what did they convert to from Judaism to Christianity in the temple? No. They converted from not living according to their covenant with God to living according to their covenant with God. Oh, I wish everybody knew that. So there was about 5,000 people. Now Acts 2:47 says, and the Lord added to the number of saved daily. Daily. So you start off with about 5,000 people, and that number increases every day. There is no way on this earth that you can put that many people in somebody's house. They didn't have a house that big in this time frame. The average house was about a 10 by 10, literally, in that time period. We know that from archaeological digs of the area. All right, so we do know this. So we're talking about the temple. Well, now, if you've got the temple is run by people who killed the Messiah, who did not believe that the Messiah was in fact God in human flesh, do you think they're going to allow them to have their services there? Well, maybe. I'm just saying, think about it. There wasn't a church for these people to go to. And by the way, if they did have the churches, how did they come up with that many pastors that quick? Anyway, where on earth did they put all those people? So the name of this message is The Assembly. Now we started off with Bamidbar, that's Numbers chapter 16 verse 2, which starts with Vayakumu, which is literally, it means, and he rose up they. In Hebrew, that's how you would say, and they rose up, and he rose up they. All right, so it's to arise from a seat, from a bed, to stand. It's from the word, the root kum, kuma Adonai, Hoshienu Elohai. Anyway, it's to, like I said, to arise, literally to stand up from a seated or lying position. You know, it's to stand up, to get out of bed, to get up from a chair. You get it? So, arise. Then it's litne, and literally that's two faces. Two faces. See, if you're alive in Hebrew, if you're alive, they don't talk about you like you're dead. Because if you're dead, you only have one face. your face doesn't move. You don't your eyes don't move up and down. They don't open and close. Your eyebrow doesn't lift up. You don't smile and then frown. Your lips don't move. You follow what I'm saying? So if you're dead, you have a face, but if you're alive, you have faces. So two faces, don't let that trip you up. It just means to somebody who's alive, literally. So it's the part that's turned towards somebody. And when they put the lamed into it, it's from the root that's to turn toward, to behold with the eyes. Of course, that's the point. You're turning from this way to that way. Left, left, lipne. I'm trying to say lepane, which would still be okay, but it's lipne in this case. So then it's Moshe. Moshe arises, right? And you do know Moshe is the one they call Moses, I hope. Then that's Va'a Nasim and men. It's a man, especially opposed to woman, a male. Think about it. When you think of, in Hebrew, Adam, or as we know it, Adam, that's the word for mankind. It's not a person's name. That's where Christianity and even the Jews as early probably as the first century, began to really, when they became very literal in their interpretations and literal in their approach to an idiomatic language and culture, when they became that way, the word Adam, which means mankind, became a person's name. And we went from God creating mankind to God creating a human being named Adam. And that really messed some people up. Still's messing them up to this day. They can't wrap their head around God creating mankind instead of God creating a man. But anyway, that's for another message. So we have the word literally for man here, anasim, men, like as in male, not female. This is the word that you would use for that. So then we have mibnei, that's literally from children. And mibnei is used both of females and males. It's another thing that messes people up. When translators began to translate mibnei, when they knew a man had only sons, they would write sons instead of children. And that it's messed things up because they don't realize that b'nai is used of women and men. So it's from the word b'nai, which means children, not man or woman. It's not gender specific. And then it says mibnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. Then it's hamishim, that's the Hebrew word for 50. Umatatim, that's and 200, 250. But they say 50, 200. 50 and 200, we say 250. Kind of the same thing, but we say it backwards. Literally, we say it backwards. In America, we speak English, and English is literally backwards compared to virtually every other language known to man. So we're the ones that are saying it backwards. It's not the other way around. Then it says 250 what? Messiah. Messiah. Literally, that means princes. It's of men, right? Not a princess. Princes, men. Men in plural. It's the prince in plural. It's to be lifted up. A general name used both of kings and of leaders of particular tribes, used, for instance, of the captains of the tribes of Israel. So he's talking about the 250 doctors of the law who were over the 250 synagogues at the time. This is hard for us to wrap our minds around because we don't think of a synagogue going back this far. It's the title of the leader of the synagogue, the Nesieh, the Nasi, if you say it in plural. But since there's 250 of them, it becomes Nesieh. Of the Edah. The next word is Edah. Synagogue. It's the assembly. It's of an appointed meeting, an assembly. especially the congregation of the Israelites. The congregation, I said that, a private domestic meeting, a family, and in a bad sense, a crowd of wicked men, because that'd be a bad sense and be a crowd of wicked men. A swarm of bees, if you will. It's from the root to point out, to define, to appoint, especially a place, to appoint to time or place. So the Adah is translated, of course, as synagogue in the Septuagint, and it's translated as synagogue because that's the Greek. They use it as the equivalent. Now let's talk about Wikipedia. And I'll be the first to tell you, don't ever get your information from Wikipedia. It's not a reliable source. But something interesting I found there they said that synagogues, in the sense of purpose-built spaces for worship, or rooms originally constructed for some other purpose but reserved for formal communal prayer, existed long before the destruction of Solomon's temple. The earliest archaeological evidence for the existence of very early synagogues comes from Egypt, where stone synagogue dedication inscriptions dating from the 3rd century BCE proved that synagogues existed by that date. So this is about the time when the Jews wound up. They were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and taken into his kingdom. The 70-year diaspora that took place. So you find these things even as far as Egypt. They went on to say the origin of the synagogue in which the congregation gathered to worship and to receive the religious instruction connected therewith is wrapped in obscurity. By the time it had become the central institution of Judaism, it was already regarded as of ancient origin, dating back to the time of Moshe. Philo and Josephus both wrote that the synagogue was in place at the time of Moshe, and they are correct. I'm reading something from the time of Moshe, by the way. This is where this verse comes from, is the time of Moshe. It was, they called, the house of the people, as found in Yirmiyahu or Jeremiah 39:8. That's, of course, in the time, the 300s BC, 400s BC. This is Nebuchadnezzar's time. It's in a midrash cited by Rashi as referring to the synagogue. The English text says the houses of the people, but the Hebrew text says the house of the people. So what's the house of the people? That's the place where they go to gather. Now, when the temple is up, that's the house of the people. But when the temple is not up, the synagogue is the house of the people. The synagogue, they go on to say, as a permanent institution, a fixed building, if you will, originated probably in the period of the Babylonian captivity, that's Nebuchadnezzar, when a place for common worship and instruction had become necessary. Now, the Midrash, as well as Josephus and Philo, tells us that there were synagogues from the time of Moshe. They would not have been synagogues as we know them from the time of the Babylon until now. Because from Babylon until now, what they're basically trying to confuse here, and what they say is confusing because they're confused. But let me try to spell it out for you. Synagogues from the time of the Babylonian exile, from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, those were buildings. That's when they started building the actual building for people to meet inside a building and have their Torah study, their worship, their Shabbat service, their Beit Din, which was the court of law, was held in that place. Their educational system was held in that place. So the synagogue, as we think of it today, began in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But the synagogue itself has always existed from the very beginning, at least from the time of Moshe, because you had 250 heads, Nesieh, of the synagogue in our verse. The synagogue in their time was held at the gates of the cities. It was held at the edges of the camps. And the Nasi, or in plural here, Nesieh, those men who were the heads of these synagogues have always been around. They were the elders of the people, the elders, the leaders of the tribes, the princes, as they were called. these men held the synagogue, and the synagogue was all of these same things that happened in the place from Nebuchadnezzar happened at the gates of the city from the very least from the time of Moshe. But if you read the book of Job, which was written in the time of Abraham, I don't know if you know that, but it's literally Job is the oldest book in the Bible. It's not placed in the front, but it did take place in the time of Abraham. So you're talking about it should probably be the first book in the Bible, but it's not. So think about that. Where did he go to take his shoe off and claim his wife? The synagogue. He went to the gates of the town. He went to the synagogue to talk to the Nicaea. All right. See, are you seeing? Synagogue's been here from a very long time. Okay. They were under the trees. They were by the sea. They were in the meadows. They were at the gates of the Jewish towns. The synagogue is a place where the children of Israel met at appointed times to learn about the Torah. That's what we call Shabbat service, to worship and pray. That would have been, of course, part of the Shabbat service, but it also would have held other times in the week, to educate their children, to train their teachers, to call public assemblies, and to decide legal matters. That's what the synagogue was from as early as Job, the oldest book in the Bible. It should be clear to us that the synagogue has been around from the beginning of Judaism. All right, so the original synagogues were without doubt the gathering place of the elders at the gates of the city. Let me think of something. It's already gone. So let's go back to our verse. Our next word, because our last word was Adah, and that's what brought us to synagogue. Synagogue is the Adah. Church is not the English equivalent of these two words. That's a bad thing to try to mix it up. Church is the English equivalent of pagan temple. It is not the English equivalent of synagogue. We need to know this. All right, so our next word in our verse is Kyrie. That's famous. It's also the word they use for called, chosen, elect. There's another word that they use for that. Kadosh is also used of that, but this is the one they're using here. It's to cry out, to call out. It's of weeping. It's often used of the cries of beasts, the moans of animals. It is used absolutely of any kind of cry, even when not articulated. To call upon, to call to anyone. When it refers to many, to call together, hence to convey a holy assembly, a feast. So it's the calling of an assembly or a feast. Those called to an assembly. To call, i.e., to invite anyone to a meal, to summon before a judge, to call anyone to an office, to choose. And then that's followed by the word moed, which is the actual word for congregation. It's a set, it's the word they're using for congregation. Let me put it that way. A set time of a point of time, especially a festival day, of space and time as appointed or defined, an assembly. And they gave the example, Ba Midbar, or Numbers 16:2, call to the assembly. That's our verse, isn't it? Jusinius and others argue that moed cannot be used to mean a place in which the assembly is held. Tregellus added the following statement to his translation of Jusinius's lexicon. He said, the fatal objection to this theory, believing that moed can be used of a place, is that high places could not be recognized of God as his places of assembly. The Kohelet, or Lamentations, chapter 2, verse 6 says, and he has violently taken away his tabernacle, as if it were a garden. He has destroyed his moed. Now they said his places of assembly. So to put it in context, I have changed it to he has destroyed his moed. Yahweh has caused the solemn feast and Shabbatot. Those are the ones that are set at a certain time. The feasts are set at a certain time. The Shabbatot, which is Sabbath in plural, it says that he has destroyed his moed. Though the moed are the appointed times, to be forgotten in Zion, and has despised in the indignation of his anger the king and the priest. Okay, this should be, he has destroyed the appointed times. He has destroyed the appointed times. Tehillim, where Psalm 74:8 says, they said in their hearts, let us destroy them together. They have burned up all the Moadim, all of the synagogues of God in the land. This is what they said. I've changed it to Moadim, because it should be, they have burned up all the appointed times of God in the land. They didn't burn up the synagogues, did they? That's not what happened. But they weren't having any of their assemblies, were they? So it should be, they have burned up all the appointed times of God, not all of the synagogues. All right, so our next word is anshe. I know it's a little discombobulated right now, but I'll pull it all together. It'll make sense in a little bit. Anshe, that's the word used for a man. It is rarely used as a singular in sense. It's rarely used in singular, in other words. Of the whole human race, a multitude, the common people. It's another word for mankind, like Adam. Then that's followed by Shem, which is used of authority. It's almost always translated name, and that gets very confusing in the Western world because they don't understand it. Name, it's in anyone's name, it's in their authority, a celebrated name, a famous name, and on and on. Here's what you need to understand about name. When they say in the name of something, that's the authority of something, not the name of Bob. We have this in our own language. Stop in the name of the law. No, we're not telling them to stop in the name of some guy named Law. What we're doing is say stop by the authority of the law. This is a peace officer, a police officer of some sort of what do you call that when someone's the FBI, CIA, NCIS, police officer, law enforcement. He's a law enforcement officer. No one knew where I was going. I couldn't think. There was a word for this. It's someone who is in law enforcement. They have the right to tell you to stop, and they have, you have to do what they say because our law gives them that authority. So stop in the authority of the law, the authority given to, what was the word I used? Law enforcement. Close enough. So let's pull this all together. Let's look at a translation that'll make this make a little more sense. And they rose up before the faces of Moshe, men of the children of Israel, 250 Nasieh of the Adah, of the synagogue, called together of the assembly, men of noble birth. That means men of noble birth. What does that mean? That means they were priests. Okay, let's take a look here real quick at Hebrews. Let's switch to Christian here. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Wow. So let's take a look at the Greek here. The first word is May. It's like the month of May. It's actually spelled M-E, literally. I put M-E-A so people will know to say May. You could put M-A-Y if you want them to pronounce it properly. But that's just the negative article. It's just no or not. It's going to make something negative. So our next word is na'azov. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the Hebrew. The Greek is ekatalepontes, which is na'azov in Hebrew, forsaking. It's to loosen bands and to let go a beast from its bonds. Take the bridle off a horse. To leave a person a place to desert. To leave anyone anywhere, to commit to anyone, to leave in his charge. So you bring a prisoner to somebody, hand him off to somebody else. It's applied to houses that are left deserted. For instance, when the children of Israel finally got into the land of Israel, The houses were deserted. They got to move into these empty houses. They didn't even have to build their houses. How cool is that? It's of ruins and all that kind of stuff. So it's a letting go of something. So it says, don't let go. Don't desert it. Don't leave it off. Hang on to it with all you got. To say the opposite. Then it says tain in Greek, which is ha in Hebrew. It's just the. It's going to be the definite article. Then it says episynagoge. Episynagoge. This freaks out every Greek geek that has ever lived because episynagoge only shows up in about 3 places in and around the 1st century CE. And it's like the Greek geeks have no concept or clue what on earth that means because epi means on or upon. They get it. Synagoge is synagogue. So don't let go of the upon synagogue. It makes no sense to a Greek. They're like, that makes no sense. But if you have just the slightest bit of knowledge of Hebrew and you realize that upon synagogue in Hebrew would be aledah, that makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. I wonder if I'm going to get into that here in a little bit. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know if I will. So I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about this. If you get rid of epi, you have synagogue. And there is no place in the Greek New Testament where they don't translate synagoge or synagogein as synagogue, except here. Because I think it's because they didn't understand it. It could be more, I could be more of a conspiracy theorist and say they did it on purpose, which is a possibility. It's a very distinct possibility since they were told by 2 different kings that they needed to do this. Constantine told them that if you don't get rid of everything Jewish, he's going to bring his army against you. So there's one reason for him to change it. And then when the Puritans decided that they wanted a translation of the Bible that matched their beliefs, not that they wanted to believe what the Bible said, but they wanted the Bible to match what they believed. That's exactly what their letter says to King James. You can read it, look it up. But they say we want a translation that is in line with the Church of England. They don't want to line up the Church of England with the biblical text. They want the biblical text to be lined up with what they believe. So King James wrote them a letter back and said, change every occurrence of ecclesia to church. And then this one, since it's synagogue, they had to get creative, artistic. They really had to go out on a limb with this one. So rather than say synagogue, they say, well, what's synagogue mean? Well, it means assembly. Now we can play with it. Don't forsake the assembling of the saints. They don't say anything about it, the saints. Anyway. So we have synagogue, and episynagoge makes no sense in Greek. But if you switch that to its Hebrew equivalent, to aledah, now you know why in Hebrew they would say upon the synagogue. Because what that means is upon something, it's the Hebrew way of saying foundation. You lay a foundation, and you build everything upon it. So if they say aledah, they're saying the foundation of the synagogue. Don't forsake the foundation of the synagogue. Translation so far, don't let loose of the foundation of the synagogue, as is the custom of some. Let me give some other examples of the word synagogue being replaced with non-Jewish words. Yaakov, or James, chapter 2, verse 2 says, for if there can come to your synagogue a man with a gold ring in goodly apparel, and there come in also a poor man in vile raiment. Go back and put synagogue in there because it says synagogue in the Greek text. Acts 13:43 says, now when the synagogue, they're saying assembly, I think. Now when the synagogue was let out, many of the Jews and religious proselytes, is what it should have said, Gentile converts to Judaism, because only Jews and proselytes were allowed in the synagogue. Gentiles were not. So now when the synagogue was let out, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Shaul, that's Paul, and Barnabas, that's Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the Torah of God. Your book says grace of God. The grace of God was a Hebrew idiom used of the Torah in that time period and in your book. The assembly of the Hasidim, the saints. The synagogue is the place where people gather together at appointed times. Are you getting it now? The synagogue is a place where people gather together at a specific time. We gather at 10 a.m. That's our synagogue. It's appointed at a specific time. The place where children are educated, the place where universities are conducted, the place where town meetings are held, the place where legal matters are decided, the place where people come to worship, the place where people come to pray, the place where people come to study the Word of God, the place where people come to hear the Rabbim teach the Word of God. Because every Shabbat, the law of Moshe, the Torah, is taught. Does it sound familiar? It should. In short, the synagogue is the center of the life of the children of God. It's the foundation. The Western world would have us believe that our children should be the center of our world, but the synagogue should not only be the center of our world, it should be the center of our children's world. Kind of gives us a different outlook on Mashalim, or Proverbs 22:6, which says, train up a child in a Torah observant lifestyle. That's the way. The way of God is a Torah observant lifestyle. Train up a child in a Torah observant lifestyle. It is the way he should go, I should say. And when he is old, it's a far different approach than trying to save our youth through fear, guilt, and shame. It's a far cry from our children feeling unworthy, unloved, and like outsiders because they don't know where they fit in this world. If the synagogue is the center of the life of a child from a young age, that child will know who they are and where they belong throughout their lives. Children whose lives are centered around the synagogue are loved by many and surrounded by others who share their experiences in life. These children don't have to wonder if they are accepted. These children don't have to feel that they are outcast or left out. Those children grow up and raise their children in the same manner. The synagogue is the center of our lives. We cannot forsake it. We must embrace it. All right. Put that button for me, please. Okay. Then you go back to the big marker tab. Mm-hmm. And no, go up there at the top where it has a picture of the camera and click on it. All right. Now, if anyone has gone back like they were asked to, they can ask the questions. You got a question? Ooh, that's a really good question. Did the children go into synagogue with the parents and receive the teaching? Here's the thing. Children were raised up knowing that the synagogue was the center of Jewish life. They knew it was important. But they weren't allowed to go into the synagogue unless they could control themselves. You couldn't take a child into the synagogue and let it scream and cry and fuss and talk and run around and lay on the couch under a blanket and sleep. And you couldn't allow things like that. What? Play with the phone, do texting, that kind of thing. They weren't allowed in if they were doing those things. They had to know that the child had to know that they had to behave themselves. They had to grow up and be all mature. So it was something that children really looked forward to, something that they aspired to, something that they wanted to do because that's where everybody else was going. But until until the child could be mature enough to handle himself or herself in that situation, they weren't allowed to go. Now, they did go to the synagogue for school. So they did go to the synagogue. They just weren't allowed to go to Shabbat service until they were able to control their emotions and whatnot. That's a really good question.
So would they be breaking the command by not being in the synagogue of the Bible, or would it be like with the
Mm-mm. Oh no, there's no breaking of a commandment here. The adults are supposed to go,
right?
and the women sometimes couldn't because they had to stay home with the children, and that's acceptable. So if they wanted to know what was going on, they had to wait till husband got home and could give his best version of what went on. Wasn't allowed to teach; he was just allowed to repeat as much as what he could. Oh, they were talking about this, and so got ordained today, and blah blah. They could catch their wife up on it. But if the wife was going to be a part of the learning process, she was going to have to get that kid in shape real quick so that she could go, because she wasn't allowed in. Otherwise, the child had to be mature enough. So it was a big deal. You know, it was something for children to look forward to. Yeah, it's exactly what we're talking about in the scripture where it says that the women need to learn from their husbands at home. You can't have these outbursts. You can't have women who don't know asking questions. You can't have children who don't know, who don't behave themselves, causing interruptions. So they would have to go home with the children, and then they'd have to just get what they can glean from their husbands. And that's not the best way to learn. But unfortunately, that's just the way it went. So them not going because they were children was not a breaking of any commandment, and them not going because they had children was not a breaking of the commandment. The husband, on the other hand, he had no reason not to go. So it was really important that the husband show up and didn't forsake it. But you're not forsaking the assembling of the saints if you're missing because your child is too young to go, or because it's that time of the month or whatever. Though they wouldn't have been allowed to go on that time of the month. I hope you understand why, especially in that time period. I mean, a lot of synagogues now build an unclean room where the women can go and they can like watch the whole ceremony on the TV and stuff like that. Quite allowable. Nothing in the Torah that says you couldn't do something like that. But they do things like that now, and they even make a what churches think of as a cry room and stuff like that. But they make it the women who want to still hear the message but have to stay home can do that. You can have some interaction in that way as well. So people have tried to work ways into making it more possible for the women to come. And what we're doing here makes that possible as well. If you can't come here to the building, you can turn it on and listen to it and even watch it. In some cases, not everybody's going to be able to watch, but if you have the capability, you can actually watch your service from home. So I mean, we're working on the same way to make it as accessible as possible. Missing the service because you got children or because you're unclean is not breaking the Torah. It's actually following the Torah. But if we can make it easier for people to still be able to hear the message and see the message, then that's great. Do we have any questions from over there? Anyone to show up over there? Ask him to email that to me. Because if it's the same link every week, then we could put that out on the website where people could just click on it. If you want to listen in live on Saturday mornings, just click here. Just take them right to it. That's pretty awesome. All right, I need my covering, and then let's go to the blessing then. Oh yeah, go ahead.
What's going to happen when the